Thank you, Lori. I'm delighted to be in this conversation with you about women's health.
Thank you so much. So let's dive right in and tell us about how you've always been an entrepreneur. I'm curious. Do you think that's in your DNA or you were taught it or how did it happen? Explain.
I'm not sure how it would show up in a DNA test, but certainly it's always been my bent to try and grow the money tree and look at different aspects of business.
And so why Vietnam? After being a lawyer, you got tired and all of a sudden got fascinated with that culture?
Well, after I worked in California Secretary of State's office, we dealt with many, many trade delegations. And when I left the Secretary of State's office, I was invited to Bangkok first to advise on doing business in the U.S. to a particular company. And they were sending a business delegation into Saigon, Vietnam. So my first trip into Vietnam was with a Thai business delegation in 1994. And it was so fascinating that within 30 days I was back. It took a number of years for the trade embargo to be dropped. And then I was able to begin doing business in Vietnam. After 13 years of establishing several companies and exporting to companies like Costco, I met Dr. Nguyen Thi Nhat Cham, who was a doctor of traditional medicine, a chemist, and using modern evidence-based research. She got her PhD in chemistry in Europe, and she was using modern evidence-based science to examine traditional medicinals and connect folklore with fact. It was fascinating.
And so from this meeting, you fell in love with the concept. What is it that triggered a partnership at that point in time?
Well, because Vietnam has such a rich history of herbal medicines. And I had learned that the US, under the FDA, has a division called Botanical Drug, where a plant based product could get drug approval. And what I learned, what the doctor was working with the Ministry of Health in Vietnam in clinical studies on both benign prostatic hyperplasia, prostate enlargement, that impacts most men. And also, they had conducted a study, a clinical study on 195 women, proving that her crinum extraction shrinks fibroids in women. And that is such, as you mentioned, up to 80% of women get uterine fibroids. And the fact that the FDA has a regulatory pathway where if you demonstrate both safety and efficacy, that product has the potential to come to market as a botanical drug. That was just fascinating. I was very fortunate to meet researchers from the University of Illinois at Chicago under the Department of Pharmacognosy, Dr. Richard Van Bremen, who were doing testing on estrogenicity, because one of the questions I had about Dr. Cham's crinum was whether or not this was a phytoestrogen, a plant-based estrogen. She felt that it was not, but Vietnam didn't have the sophisticated testing to determine that at that time. So UIC did that testing and confirmed that her crinum cultivar is not a phytoestrogen. It appears to deliver the benefits of estrogen without the risks of estrogen. So we published that study and it was presented at the Menopause Society.
Would you explain for our listeners who may not be aware of why estrogen is something you don't want to have in a supplement? Why it's important, especially for people in pregnancy and for fertility issues and the like?
Well, just underlying that I am not a doctor. And so the disclaimer is this is not medical advice. I'm just giving you my opinion. Estrogen absolutely fuels the female body, and it's something that we need, but it needs to be in balance. And as a woman goes through her natural biological evolution throughout life, that balance can change. So it needs to be monitored. And
And
excess estrogen can be a problem because there's so much estrogen in environmentally and in the foods that we're consuming. So too much estrogen is a problem, too little estrogen is a problem. But you don't want to be taking too much estrogen for the treatment of uterine fibroids. That's how the current drugs work. They are what's called GnRH agonists or antagonists. The current drugs available for uterine fibroids all work by chemically inducing menopause. They suppress ovulation, and in that impact, they hope to shrink the fibroids or at least impact the symptoms of having fibroids, which is the heavy pain and very heavy menstrual bleeding. But if the reason you're trying to shrink your fibroids is so you can get pregnant and have a baby, and you take a drug that renders you infertile for a long period of time, it's not a good solution. Those drugs are regulated by the FDA and are not allowed to be taken for longer than 2 years because of the toxicity associated with those drugs over a long term. And reading the package inserts on some of those drugs, if a woman takes the drug for 1 year, 20% of the women may experience osteoporosis, irreversible osteoporosis. So it was important to be able to develop a drug that can treat both the symptoms and the condition of uterine fibroids without estrogen. And that's the magic of what we've been able to develop at Altin Sciences, is a botanical drug candidate that can achieve that result.
And so explain to me, so you created Crila Health in 2007, and then you set up Altin Biosciences, if I'm correct, in 2022. What is it that took you 15 years? Why that delay, let's say?
The lack of funding for development in women's health in particular, but in general, it's been very difficult to be able to demonstrate that we can provide the assets for a good business development here. The key thing that we did that starting in 2022 was working on getting the patent, because a natural product can't be patented. Here we had two different pharmaceutical grade plant extracts, one from the Crinum latifolium and one from epigallocatechin gallate, EGCG, green tea. So both of these botanical compounds have separately been studied in clinical studies for the treatment of uterine fibroids. Compounds have essentially been in human use for centuries. They are safe in the dosages that we need, but you couldn't patent either one of them. So to be able to raise investment, you need to create a patent estate. And it took several years for us to get to the point where we could do that, but we did. And so
Good.
that patent was granted in 2025.
Yeah, in
So
June. Now.
in June, yeah, June the 1st. So the challenge in trying to patent a natural botanical compound is that if compound A works, let's say it has 25% efficacy against a condition, and compound B has 20% efficacy, and in combination then, you must be able to demonstrate significantly more than 45% efficacy. So you have to show synergy, that 1 + 1 = 5, 6, 7, or 8, something like that. And at first, when we were experimenting with these compounds with Dr. Ayman Al-Hendi, who is the global key opinion leader on both the research and treatment of uterine fibroids at the University of Chicago, and Dr. Al-Hendi had human uterine fibroid cell lines that we could test against. So initially, I had him test the crinum compound alone to prove to him its efficacy on fibroids, and the EGCG compound, which he'd previously tested, but now we were testing apples to apples. And indeed, we found that together they work better than either one separately. So first we found additive effect, 1 + 1 = 2. But as we delved into it deeper, my on the patent, Adam Payne, who's the CEO of a company called Ultra Botanica, Adam helped me get over the goal line in finding several formulations where we could reach synergy, where a little bit of the EGCG actually explodes the efficacy of the crinum on the anti-proliferation of fibroid cells. So we found both cell apoptosis, cell death, and then synergistically the anti-proliferation of the cells, which means the fibroid can't replicate itself. And as those cells naturally die, the fibroid shrinks. We licensed our patent to Altin Biosciences, our company, that Dr. Al-Hindi is also part of this company. And so now we're talking to in early stages to large pharmaceutical companies that are seeking a non-hormonal treatment for fibroids. They all want to see our early stage human data. So our next step is to do a phase 1 or a phase 2A study demonstrating that, and then Big Pharma will come in with money for our development. But the challenge is for small biotechs now, we have to raise all the money for that early development ourselves. A very encouraging aspect of the FDA's botanical drug guidance is if the FDA is satisfied as to the safety of both of these compounds, both of which have been in human use for centuries, they may allow us to jump directly to a phase 2A study. And that's all encouraging. The developments in the pharmaceutical industry under COVID are encouraging for accelerating bringing a drug safely to market. So it is our hope, if finance comes in and we get the results that we expect, that this drug could come to market in significantly less than 10 years. We'd hope to do it in 5.
Wow. So that's
Yeah,
a relatively short
that's
time span.
light speed. It is.
Normally it's double, right? So that's
It used to
optimistic.
be far, far longer. But the issue is venture capital wants a substantial return, a 12x or higher return in 2 years. And you cannot do drug development in 2 years, not at this point. So we're looking to the private sector to help fund bringing this product to market, at which point we expect at least a 10x return for our investors. There's no question that a new fibroid drug has been evaluated independently as being about a $2 billion a year drug. So pharma will reap that, but we have to do the groundwork.
Well, it's amazing. You've put it all in a nutshell, and you've gone over all of my questions very quickly. So now at the moment, you're trying to raise $300,000 in SAFE with the intent of obtaining $6 million in seed later on. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I'm a little over halfway through that 300,000. I'm fortunate at this time of year, as we're entering October, November, December, many high wealth individuals are looking for a good tax deduction. And they want a tax deduction that's meaningful. And I have several C3s that support my research. And so we have an avenue where someone can make a significant tax donation, and the money then comes through to support our research. The American Botanical Council has done that on our behalf. Last year, there was an OBGYN from Atlanta who donated $250,000 that has paid for a lot of our legal and preparatory work.
Well done. And
So
I see that you've also sought support from a number of female groups, because obviously women's health is an issue that is not of huge concern in the VC world, or is increasingly now, thank goodness, but it was rather underfunded. So you've actually got to the interest groups, the Black women who have a higher prevalence of fibroids, and sought their support to raise money, which is incredibly sharp. And also, I imagine that your president's in the Rotary Club has given you access to a number of contacts that have helped, or am I wrong in asking that?
actually, I wasn't expecting that question, but you're not wrong. Many of my early investors are friends of mine that I've met through Rotary International. And they've been able to travel to Vietnam and meet me, meet the doctor there, see the plantation. And when you stand on the earth and you feel the earth and you see the plants growing and you realize the magic in the healing properties that these plants offer us, it's very sustaining.
And also, I imagine people are already trying at a different level. Obviously, it's not the same compound, and it's only a herbal supplement. But Crila Health is accessible already. You can purchase it. You can get a bottle for what, $40, $50, and see the benefits already on your periods, on your prostate, on your menopause symptoms. Am I right?
We can say that it supports prostate, menopause, and uterine health. And we conducted studies that demonstrate the efficacy of the Crila supplement for men with prostate, concerned about prostate health, and also for women with menopause symptoms. We had 93% of the women in our menopause study experienced significantly improved symptoms using the menopause quality of life survey.
So, to what extent does this testing ground, shall I say, of Crilla Health help you make a proof of concept for Altin Biosciences? Is there a correlation nonetheless, even though
Well,
it's not treated?
the FDA has been saying that they are more open to looking at what they call real world evidence. And part documentation for the FDA on the safety of our crinum extract will be the fact that this ingredient has been used and been available as a legal dietary supplement in the US for 15 years. So, a strong case for safety there.
So
But
that
we still, under the botanical drug guidance, you still have to, if this is a drug, you still have to go through the rigorous peer-reviewed clinical studies that demonstrate both safety and efficacy. And that's what we want. We want to know that the products we put in our bodies are safe and efficacious. We don't expect to be the distribution company for this drug. We would expect to license to a pharmaceutical partner at phase 2 data. And then we'll go on and do the next one because there are more in our pipeline.
Awesome. But in terms of a supply chain, considering the geopolitical context at the moment, that is not extremely predictable, shall we say? How do you deal with questions from investors with regard to the fact that all of the plants are in Vietnam?
Well, they're in Vietnam for now, but
Ah,
we may have the ability to expand plantations to mitigate any supply chain concerns. And this plant is a bulb, and so if you give that mother bulb room, she throws off 4 to 8 baby bulbs every year. So production can be expanded exponentially.
very well. Okay. I'd now like to turn to the person, less the business, but more the person behind the business, and ask you how you've navigated as an older woman who is not a PhD in science, the biotech space and the venture capitalist one, where typically startups are founded by young males or very young women. You don't fit the picture. Has that been helpful or, on the contrary, worn you down in some way?
Well, I would say it's been helpful. It's true, I'm a JD, not an MD or a PhD, but I thought of something that the MDs and PhDs hadn't come up with. So getting the patent gets you through the door. But for coming up on 20 years now, I've been attending these conferences held at the National Center for Natural Products Research in the US and American Botanical Society and other educational events where if you just keep showing up and you surround yourself with the team of the top leaders in this industry, our doctors from U Chicago and Johns Hopkins and Rutgers are the tops in the fields. I don't have to know everything. as long as the people behind me are the best at what they do. And Alton has assembled a top clinical, regulatory, and commercialization team. Our chief business officer spent 30 years with Bayer and led the women's health marketing division in Bayer and said, Sue, we were looking for something like the drug that Alton is developing.
I would say that your experience and your legal background is most helpful when it comes to developing patents, but also in simply communicating to VCs, because you're incredibly articulate. And for having listened to a number of startup pitches, you do the best job because of your articulate eloquence and the way you can summarize and explain a story in a very convincing way. So I'm pretty sure that's been an asset so far and will continue to be. What is your recommendation to women founders, especially in the women's health space? What advice can you give in light of your experience to date?
Well, we're starting to get to the maybe the top of the hill, I hope. We are seeing much more discussion openly. When I wear my uterus pin now, I even have men saying, "Oh, tell me about that. Why are you wearing that? What are you doing?" I had one man at one point in it was a pitch contest, and he said, "But I know many women and none of them have fibroids." And there was this wave that went through the audience. And I said, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of fibroids in this room. And I'm encouraging men to have that dinner conversation with their wives, with their daughters. And young women, adolescent women need to be having these conversations because too often the pain and the heavy bleeding are normalized, and that's a negative word. The mothers or the aunts or the sisters say, "Oh, we all had it. It runs in the family." But no, it's abnormal uterine bleeding. Abnormal pain is not normal and needs to be addressed, and we need better solutions to address these because it impacts every part of a woman's life. The burden of uterine fibroids in the U.S. has been quantified by Dr. Buchitra Singh from Johns Hopkins, and his team has looked at what it costs the U.S. because of uterine fibroids, and it's over $42 billion a year. About half of that is medical costs for hysterectomies and the drugs that do exist. And about half of that is societal costs, lost women's labor hours, lost education. You know, Lori, if you're the woman with heavy fibroids, curled up in pain, bleeding for a couple of weeks out of the month, you may not get the promotion at work. Oh, we can't depend on Lori to represent us at the conference next August. She might be sick that day. You know, it has this invisible impact. And because of that, and because hysterectomy has become rather a conventional surgery, it is still the standard of care for fibroid treatment is hysterectomy. And again, this is my opinion only, but I believe hysterectomy should not be a conventional surgery. Cancer, different story. But for these other conditions, we're now learning about the long-term consequences of having had a hysterectomy. There was a study that came out last week from South Korea that, again, equalizing for other conditions, women who've had a hysterectomy have a higher incidence of thyroid cancer. Mayo Clinic, Arizona State have done studies saying women that have had a hysterectomy have an 8% higher prevalence of early onset dementia. There is a uterus brain connection that we don't understand. And I realize we're supposed to be talking personally, not about business. But my personal advice for younger women is if you've got something and you know it works and you know it needs to come to market, you've got to surround yourself with the people that will support you, and you just don't give up. Just keep going.
I love that.
Have these conversations. Have these conversations with the boys. We do a summer camp for girls in Vietnam to keep it's a Rotary supported project through the Pacific Links Foundation to keep girls in school and not get trafficked. And one of my Rotary friends and I, we teach a class on menstruation. And these
Oh.
are in kind of open air cabanas. And the boys keep trying to walk by and listen because they need this information too.
And do you have the similar type of education for premenopause and menopausal symptoms?
Well, my colleague Carol Johnson, who is the head of Uterine Kind, is launching a program called Inspired Inside to teach adolescent girls more about their body. This is not sex ed. This is health and biology. There was a white paper study that came out a couple of years ago surveying high school girls graduating from high school. 76% of them said they learned more about the biology of a frog than their own bodies. And Inspired Inside is the program that is telling girls you are art and science. You need to understand this and celebrate it.
Well, I find that incredibly inspiring, Sue. Thank you so much. You are, I calculated, maybe I'm wrong, but around 72. And my question is, when do you sleep? And what's next?
I don't sleep much, and because I work across all different time zones, I'm not quite 72. But, there are more. The doctor in Vietnam, who's older than I, said, "Sue, I have more in here. So we need to get this first one done, and then there is more coming."
Amazing.
Vietnam has 4 to 5,000 botanicals that are classified, as medicinal. They have things that we haven't even thought of yet.
So there's plenty more in your pipeline coming up.
There's plenty more to come.
I'm very honored to have been able to speak with you. Thank you so much, Sue. It was a very interesting conversation that I hope we can continue at some later point.
Thanks, Lori.